Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. It's officially afternoon. Welcome to the Litigation Center's Psychology of the Courtroom. My name is Rachel Brockle. I'm the director of the Litigation Center here at Golden Gate University School of Law. And today I am excited to introduce our speaker of the day, Melissa Gomez. She's a nationally known jury consultant and the president of MMG Jury Consulting LLC. She also holds a PhD in psychology and a Master of Science in Education from the University of Pennsylvania. So over the past 20 years, she has consulted on close to 1,000 criminal and civil jury trials across the United States with a focus on the psychology of learning, behavior, and decision-making. And that has to do with jurors, obviously. So Dr. Gomez has spoken on jury-related topics on the local and national level, which includes stations such as CNN, CBS, CBC, NPR, MSNBC, and NBC. She designs and conducts mock trials and focus groups. She assists with witness preparation and jury selection and develops educational and persuasive strategies for trial. So through her years of research, she's developed extensive national database containing key preconceptions, attitudes, and experiences of over 4,000 jury eligible adults. She's designed and delivered CLE lectures for the American Bar Association, the Pennsylvania Bar Institute, the National Seminar for Federal Defenders, Temple University Law School, University of Pennsylvania Law School, the American College of Trial Lawyers, the American Association for Justice, and the Sixth Circuit Judicial Conference, and of course, here with GGU now. Dr. Gomez is a faculty member for the Temple University's Beasley School of Law LLM program. She has designed and developed CLE lectures for the ABA, the Pennsylvania Bar Institute, and many of the other things I mentioned where she's helped develop the CLEs, those are similarly listed. And she's widely published on many topics of witness preparation, jury research, and juror perspectives. So Dr. Gomez is the author of two books, Jury Trials Outside In, Leveraging Psychology from Discovery to Decision, and then published by LexisNexis and the National Institute of Trial Advocacy, NITA. Many of you know NITA from watching their webcasts and getting training from them. And then the Witness Preparation Partner, a guide to becoming the ready messenger. So a copy of her book at the end of this program. So if you want to hang tight until the end of the program, we are going to raffle off a copy of her book Outside In, and that'll be raffled off at the end. So hang tight till the end there. And then lastly, Dr. Gomez resides in the Chestnut Hill neighborhood of Philadelphia with her husband, twin sons, and her Australian Shepherd named Figaro. So I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Gomez in just a moment. For those of you here for MCLE, please make sure to email Chloe. You probably emailed baxterfellow@ggu.edu to RSVP for this event. That's where you'll also write after the event to request your MCLE form that you'll keep in case the bar needs to see that. So again, thank you, Dr. Gomez, for being here. We really appreciate it. And I'll turn the floor over to you now.
Thanks so much, Rachel. Really excited to be presenting to both students and some attorneys alike. So I want to make sure that I'm touching on topics for everyone. So for those not familiar with what a jury consultant does, I just want to give you a little bit of background. So I am not an attorney. I don't have a JD. As Rachel mentioned, I have a PhD in psychology. And so when I am working on a case with a client, I'm really coming in from the perspective of psychology, the perspective of the people, which sometimes when you get your hands into the case and you're really thinking about the law, thinking about all of the things that you've been taught, sometimes it's really hard to take that step back. And understand how, number one, how other people may perceive the case differently than you. But also, when we think about jury consultants, when we think about psychology in the courtroom, most, if not all of you are probably thinking just about jurors. What are jurors thinking? How are they going to respond to me? But psychology in a courtroom goes a lot broader than that. There is psychology associated with your witness. There's psychology associated with the judge, and there's psychology associated with you as the person presenting. And so as a jury consultant, as a psychologist who works, in the courtroom, actually one of the biggest compliments I've ever gotten was a dean of Temple University Law School. And he said, all right, Melissa, there are a lot of jury consultants, but I consider you an applied psychologist. You're focusing this on the courtroom. and really helping us understand how people process being in that situation. And so when we talk about psychology of the courtroom, we're talking about, essentially how do people interact with the context of litigation. And it's in the courtroom, and it's all the things that are leading up to being in the courtroom. And so one of the prime, this is a quote that I found from Anais Nin that really defines what it is that we do, what it is that we're looking for. And it's that we don't see things as they are, we see things as we are. And so once you understand the humanity behind every part of what we do, it can help you to think a little bit differently and hopefully start to step outside yourself, because once you're getting into litigation, once you're getting into negotiation, once you're getting into witness preparation, these things become as relevant and sometimes even more relevant than the evidence in the law itself. So I want to talk about the things that influence psychology. So we're going to start obviously with the jurors. That's usually, where people want to really consider, how is this impact, is psychology impacting our decision makers? And it's important to look at what are the experiences that folks have? What are the things that they're exposed to that could affect their perceptions, not just of the case at hand, but their role in that case? So, when we think about media exposure, which has become it's always been relevant, but it's really become particularly relevant since the start of the pandemic, when people are focusing much more on what they're seeing, what they're able to see on their phone, what they're able to see on their screens, because their human action has been stunted, for lack of a better term, for the past year and a half. So when you think about what are the themes, what are we seeing in the media that are affecting the psychology and affecting the way people think? Well, of course, a lot of issues of abuse of power, abuse of political power. We see that every day in the news. We also see issues about corporations. How are they behaving? Are they misbehaving? Another big issue for the past, couple of years have been this sort of idea of abuse of sexual power. And so one of the things that as an observer of the world and as an observer in juries, I was curious, I'm seeing this theme that's been, was pre-pandemic. This has been going on for years. And how does our culture of focus on abuse of power affect the way that people perceive stories, especially when the story has to do with, one person versus a corporation or an entity of power, whether it's the police or a company or anyone else versus someone who isn't seen as having as much power. And so as Rachel had mentioned when she went over my bio, one of the things that I do when I am conducting research on any specific trial is that we'll collect some data on what are preconceptions that people have about relevant topics and their role as jurors. And so this is a snapshot of a piece of data that I have in my database. And you can see I have a little over 1,000 people who I've asked this question to over the past several years. And the question is, do people in positions of power tend to abuse that power they have for their own gain or pleasure? And in that sample of jury eligible adults, what we learned was that over half believed that to be true. And so once you understand, okay, so is this a preconception? Is this something that people believe in the community? How does that affect? Where are the perceptions of power in my case, in my story, and how is this preconception going to play out? Okay. Another theme we're starting to see, or that we've been seeing over the past several years, is this idea of speaking out, having a voice, protests about things that big picture issues that people find to be very important, whether it's human rights or gun control or immigration. Let's let those go. And so this adds another question. Okay, so we're seeing this idea of perceptions of power. We're seeing this movement of people to speak out for what they believe in. We saw January 6th riots, you're seeing protests, you're seeing people speaking out for what they believe in all of these different contexts and many more. And so when observing, again, what are these issues happening in our world? What are these issues happening in our community? What happens when you take people from that community and put them in a jury box? How does this affect them? So again, as an empiricist, I asked the question in my research. So here we asked, it's an important part of a jury's job to send messages to society with its verdict. And I got about 1,200 people in this particular piece of my database. And again, about a 50-50 split where more jurors agreeing that, yeah, I want to send a message to society. Now, if you think about it, when you're looking at your case, when you're trying to make a decision, how am I going to tell the story of my defendant or of, or if we're in a civil case of my plaintiff? And you're thinking just about what are the facts of this case and what are the legal principles that I need to prove for this case or that need to be proven against my client for this case. If you're also not looking at what this story may represent from a bigger perspective, you're likely going to be missing out on something that you can be weaving in to the way you're telling the story, because the jurors there are going to be some that are very literal, logical minded, rule followers. We see that. But what we see more as those folks who say, that's not right. There's something bigger happening. You know what? That reminds me of this issue that's happening in our world. And I think I want to say something about that. And when you're understanding what are the bigger picture messages, what are the issues that your story touches on that will be a way that people relate to it, that can certainly affect the way that they make their decisions in order to send those messages that they feel it should be sent. Okay. Now, of course, we deal with issues of political polarization, which, so you have these perceptions. And another thing that I'm seeing is how do this polarized nation that we live in, how does that affect jury trials? Well, I've been doing this for 20 years, and I'm telling you, compromise is not something we're seeing as much even in deliberations, depending on where we are. It's not part of our culture anymore. Compromise is not part of our culture anymore. And so that is starting now to come into the jury room. So it's understanding, it's not just about the case. It's not staying narrow about what is the story and what is the law, but really understanding what's the context in which we're telling the story and how's that context going to affect the way that people receive the story. Okay. So this has been happening for years. And then, of course, we have what I call the 2020 effect, where we started with political division and we got more political division. We started with, issues of the economy and we get more. And so what I've been looking at in the past couple of years is what are some of the media themes? What are some of the issues that have risen to the top specifically in the past year and a half or so that have become even more important because of this? I talk about the 2020 effect overall, because what has been going on in this country, the pandemic is the big overarching thing, but that's not the only thing we've been going through in the past 18 months. There have been many historical events that have been happening here in our country. And so what are the themes that we're seeing from 2020, 2021? Well, the first one is economy versus safety. So if we take a step back and we think about, for example, let's think about your general product liability case, where a plaintiff is saying that a company put profits over safety, that they didn't put enough safety, they didn't make its product safe enough, or there were inherent dangers in the product and it hurt someone. So this theme of profits over people is something that we see a lot in injury cases, in civil injury cases. So one of my questions this year was, well, we've just spent 18 months fighting as a nation over what's more important, safety or our economy. How does that, so are things changing? Does that impact the way that people perceive this whole corporate profits over people issue? These are the important questions that we need to be asking as we take that step back and realize that the context, again, the context is important. When, not just what is our case, but when are we telling it? And what is happening in the world as we're telling it? Defund the police versus Blue Lives Matter. I see, when I pick juries, here in Pennsylvania, we get a standard juror questionnaire, and the jurors fill out two sides. One side is for criminal and one side is for civil. And so if I'm picking a jury for a civil case, usually the court says, yeah, don't worry about what's on that criminal side of the questions. I still look anyway, because there are two questions that I find are some of the most relevant to civil cases, even though they're specifically related to criminal cases. And those questions are you more likely to believe the testimony of a police officer because of his or her job? Or are you less likely to believe the testimony of a police officer because of his or her job? And if someone circles yes to either of those questions, I want to know about it if I'm dealing in a case where we're dealing with an individual plaintiff versus a corporation. Because what that shows is, even though there may not be any police officers in my case, that gives me an idea of the relationship folks have with authority. So sometimes you're not able to get the exact piece of information that you want in the way you want it, but when you can find the other cues to give you that sense, you need to know what you're looking for. I want to know, okay, political, are we dealing with establishments of power? Are we dealing with people who feel like they abuse the power? Well, if I see someone who doesn't believe the police because of their job, that's a person who believes that people abuse their power. And that can be dangerous if, for example, I'm defending a corporate defendant, okay? Again, the racial tension of this past year has been palpable. The China virus, Black Lives Matter, all of that. And these are issues on both sides of the coin when you're looking at your litigants, when you're looking at your client and wondering how, if you're representing a person of color, or if you're on the other side against a person of color, how does that affect what is the community that you're living in, and how are you making sure you're telling your story in a respectful way, in order not to trigger, number one, those biases, or number two, to trigger people to feel as though you're treating someone as if their life doesn't matter. And this has been a big issue. Again, it's been a big issue for defendants, is how do I defend my case while still demonstrating that their lives matter? These are lives that matter. Just, my client just isn't the one that caused them injury. So it's that struggle that people go through. On the other hand, we have folks who are, who may experience some bias. And so how do you gently ask those questions? I actually just picked a jury for a product liability case where we're representing an Asian company, and we were going to have Asian defendant or Asian corporate representatives talking about the company who didn't speak English. And so how do we gently ask about that bias? Well, we asked about the products and not the people. Do you have a mistrust in products that are not made in the USA? Do you have a mistrust in products that are made in Asia, so that we could get to those biases in a way that helped people kind of feel better about answering that question, yes, as opposed to asking, would you tend to doubt or have any hesitancy believing an Asian person's testimony? No one's going to say yes to that. And so we want to make sure, how do we get to that in a way that is not offensive and a way that is palatable and the way to get to the yes. Another theme of the crisis is individual responsibility, which is very important when, again, if we're defending a individual plaintiff where there may be some issues of comparative negligence. What did you do? What did you do to cause your own outcome? These are questions that have always been asked. And, so it's not all one way or the other where the criticisms go. And it's understanding how these issues are going to affect your case. And then, of course, protecting those at risk has also been a huge theme of the pandemic this year, and it's something that how does that play into the story that we're telling? So again, we have an idea of what people are thinking, but as folks go through historic events, and the past year and a half has certainly been abrupt, and a very sudden and traumatic change in perceptions and traumatic issues that people have gone through. But also it's important to keep in mind that we don't necessarily need something as intense as a pandemic in order for perceptions to change over time. But we just happen to be in a world where we are hopefully coming out of the end of a very historical time in our history. And so what I try to look at is, how do things track over time? So again, this is from the database. And if you remember that question I asked before, people positions of power tend to abuse that power they have for their own gain or pleasure. I said, okay, well, what were we looking at before the pandemic? We were looking at a little over half saying yes to that. And in the research, and I actually have done about 10 mock trials since the pandemic, you can see that percentage went up substantially, 55 to 73%. And so understanding, again, how do those historical events, how does the time that we're living in affect perceptions? This is a great example of that. And so it's really important as litigators to never get complacent and to never make assumptions that things are just going to stay the same. So what does this mean when you're thinking about, all right, so how are different people going to react to my case story? Okay. So as a psychologist, so one of the things we like to look at is bias. And that's sort of why we're collecting that data, why we're collecting pre-perception data. What are the biases that are already out there? What causes people to have a certain perception and stick with that perception? And there are two important biases that tend to drive the way a preconception, the way an attitude will cause a person to view evidence in a case. And the first is called the confirmation bias. So essentially, that is, we interpret facts and we look for facts that confirm what we already believe. And sometimes we've seen, examples of this, accusations of this in the media, of ignoring those things or putting aside those things or finding a way to explain away those things that don't comport with what we already believe. And so that's a safer way to be. We don't want to have to change our core and important beliefs. So that's the confirmation bias. And essentially it's based on the vantage point. We have this little cartoon here where one guy's saying, no, that's a 9. And the other guy's saying, no, that's a 6. And it's because of their vantage point. Is either of them wrong? Depends on who you're asking. But that's people want to confirm. They want to feel safe understanding things in the way that they identify with as true. The other bias is called the availability bias. We tend to believe something is true or that something is prevalent because we've seen it, because it's something that's available to us. And so, I know that a lot of you are pretty young, but if I have any children of the 70s or 80s listening to this, you'll understand my example. When I was young, every cartoon, every TV show, every adventure show had your hero or heroine coming across quicksand and getting sucked into the earth. And so when I was a child, I thought that I was going to get sucked into the earth by quicksand because it was on every TV show. It was available to me. It was something that was true because I was exposed to it. So, we have this comedian who, when he made this joke, I totally related to it. He thought that quicksand was going to be a much bigger problem in our lives than it turned out to be. And that's because of the availability bias. That's what was available to us through our television shows. So here is the big question, and here has been the big question of this pandemic for me as a jury consultant who's been working with jury psychology for 20 years and thinking, am I at square one now? Because when we're looking at the confirmation bias and the availability bias, what happens when there's a historical event that is just so big that now the confirmation bias and the availability bias are in conflict, right? That the information that's available to you is not what you believed. Is that, this idea that our health system is the best in the world and, oh my gosh, these viruses, they're no big deal. We could come up with something that it'll never shut us down. Well, then here we are, aren't we? And so it was that kind of shock to the system that happened globally to everyone that caused, that make this pandemic, make the psychology behind it and how that affects jury decision making so fascinating to me. So, empiricist, what do? I ask a question. So I have, as I said, we've done several mock trials since the pandemic, and this is a question that we've been asking. We have about 133 people who've answered this question. COVID-19 caused me to change my opinions or perspectives I held before the pandemic. We have 71% either agreeing or strongly agreeing. So the question is, what are those opinions? And how do they relate and how are they associated with the story that you need to tell to people as jurors? And so, it's doing that research, it's understanding, it's knowing, I'm not here to answer the questions because the answers to the questions differ with every case. But it's really about knowing what questions to ask and knowing what to look for and knowing when to, how to take that step back to think broadly about the issues that are happening in the world, issues that are happening, it doesn't even have to be national, that are happening locally that can affect the way that people are thinking, or even issues within one particular life, within one particular person's life that affects the way that they see their case, how they connect to your story. So it's about understanding the juror vantage point, different from your vantage point. People who are not well-versed in law, they're likely not well-versed in the subject matter of the lawsuit, and odds are they're not quite as excited to be in the courtroom as you are. So, as we're looking, you have some people who are excited to be there. Sometimes those are actually the scariest jurors of all when they actually want to be in the courtroom because that's not normal. But when we look at, especially in times of COVID, it's not just whether they want to be there, but why they don't want to be there. And so, as I'm picking juries, and I've picked 2 juries in the past week, I've probably, I've picked several because different venues are rolling out jury trials at different times. And so since I work nationally, I've been in the courtroom for the past 8-9 months. And so it's been interesting in seeing who's showing up, who's coming, and how does that affect the pool of people who are coming to jury trials. And so I asked in my research, because it's what I do. And so what we found is when we did an analysis of political orientation to what they would do, what a person would do when they get a jury summons, Conservative jurors were much more likely to just show up and not worry. Politically moderate jurors were also willing to show up and not worry, but to a lesser degree, and were more likely to say, I'd go, but I'd be a little nervous. And the liberal-minded jurors out of the three were much more likely to say they would attend but be nervous, 35% as compared to 14 and 5%. And so when you have such a political split between people who are comfortable being in the room, how does that affect the way that people are going to perceive your trial? When you have someone sitting as a juror, listening to a story potentially of someone who was injured, of someone who was harmed, of someone who was killed, and then fearing for their own health and safety while sitting there. Well, number one, would they even be there? Because what I'm seeing is a lot of judges are letting people out for that very reason. Well, now you have the conundrum. Have we just taken out an identifiable segment of the community and now created an imbalance in the jury pool? So you either do that, or you have people sitting in the box who are uncomfortable and are worrying about their own health and safety. Can I tell you which one's better? No, because neither is very good. But at some point, you know, what the courts are saying is that we have to move on. But what's important for litigators and what's important as you think about, okay, how does the psychology of people affect the way they see the case, is understanding the impact of those kinds of issues that hopefully, you know, for the students, they will never have to deal with once they actually get to the point that they're in jury trials. But, you know, when it's not this, it'll be something else. And it's just important to kind of have a sense of what will it be? What will it be? What are the things that we need to be looking at? So it's also understanding expectations. What is the society that we live in? There are big differences between younger jurors who are used to living in an age of transparency, an age of communication, versus older jurors who are used to, you know, just not getting as much information and being just fine with that. And so how expectations may differ, not just with the community as a whole, but with different segments of the population are also something that, you know, we're looking at and trying to understand. So what are the kinds of things that are going to be important for my case and the jurors that I want to identify for striking later on, people who are going to be dangerous to me because of the case facts and those evolving expectations. So what I'm seeing overall is a level of mistrust. And I'm seeing that mistrust affect both sides of the cases. Because people know that when they're being presented with a case, when they're being presented something by claim for prosecution and then defense, that both sides have an agenda. They have something that they're trying to sell them, right? And so it's identifying how do I, you know, where am I going to get that pushback? Where am I going to find the resistance? Where am I going to lose trust in the way I'm telling my story? Okay, so this is where we can start to filter in, okay, now we're thinking about our witnesses, now we're thinking about our story, we're thinking about how sometimes what happens is we get a little too smart for ourselves. We get a little too strategic for ourselves. And you need to understand where that strategy and where that cleverness isn't going to pass the sniff test. Okay, because if you think about, you know, one of the things I do is I look at different industries and how do they grapple with these things. And marketing is a very relevant industry to what we do, because essentially what we're trying to do is we're marketing a story, we're marketing a position, we're marketing, packaging the evidence up the way that we want it to be received. And so I found this as a lesson in skepticism for marketing. And typically what they found is that consumers are skeptical of a marketing story if the story sounds too good to be true, if they're too dramatic, and they're told by hired guns. Sounds like experts. It sounds like what can happen in jury trials. And so sometimes the best understanding of psychology and mistrust is to know when to step back and make concessions, when to step back and seem more credible by not having that perfect story. Because folks tend to disbelieve that perfect story, especially, you know, given all of the other things that are going on, or like the abuse of power and personal responsibility. And so it's understanding not just where your strategy is, but it's understanding where that strategy starts to lack credibility.
And Dr. Gomez, you have a question from Dominique Williams.
Mm-hmm.
I think that was a mistake. I don't remember pressing that. Sorry.
Oh, okay. No worries. We can help you put your hand down there. No worries. Thanks, Carrie.
No worries. Okay. All right. Yeah, I can't see the hands, Rachel. So if there's anything that comes up, just let me know. So
Absolutely.
The next thing I want to make sure we're talking about, because remember I said it's not just about jurors. It's all the aspects of psychology. It's all the aspects. And so, you know, an important piece of that we sometimes ignore are our witnesses. And whether it's our primary witness or other witnesses, you know, I have prepared thousands of witnesses. And some of those witnesses are doctors, they're engineers, they're truck drivers, they're celebrities, they're CEOs, they're all of it. And what I have found is that testifying is the great equalizer. It stresses everyone out. Nobody likes to be challenged in that way. No one likes to have their words used against them. And different people respond to stress in different ways. And so typically, you know, when I start working with a client on preparing their witness and I kind of get a sense of the interaction, what we tend to forget as attorneys is that this is our playground. We're used to this. This is where we succeed. This is what our education is in. Our witnesses are lost. They have no idea what's going on. And sometimes their questions are absolutely simple and basic. And I mean, that's, you know, Rachel mentioned the second book that I wrote. I wrote it specifically for this issue. And it gets down to like, who's in the room when you're having your deposition taken? Our witnesses don't know that unless they've had their deposition taken before. And sometimes just even knowing that can relieve their stress, because if we're not cognizant of their level of anxiety and where they're at, you think about what can happen in testimony. You know, what does stress do to us? It makes us feel sick. It makes us foggy. It makes us restless. It makes us irritable. So there are two kinds of messages for a trial overall, but, you know, especially for a particular witness. The first is the content message. What is the information that witness needs to teach the jury? What is their message? Why are they there? What are they there to say? Is it the plaintiff who needs to explain their injuries? Is it a corporate representative that needs to explain the corporate policies and procedures? Is it an expert who is going through the, you know, whatever the composition of a particular product? And the second kind of message is just as, if not more important than that content message. And that's what I call the image message. So I'll tell you a little activity that I recommend that each and every one of you do with each and every one of your witnesses. And it is, pick some adjectives, you know, witness X. Pick some adjectives. How would you like the jury to describe you in light of the messages, in light of what you need to teach them? Well, I want them to think that I am professional and knowledgeable and kind and all of those wonderful things. Okay. Well, what do you think the other attorney, how do you think that person wants the jury to describe you? Oh, well, they want me to seem like I have no idea what I'm doing and that I'm mean and that I'm money hungry or blah, blah, blah. Okay. So now let's think about, how do you react to stress? How do you react to when someone's challenging you? Is it easy for you to be kind and knowledgeable and confident when you feel like someone's yelling in your face? No, it's not. And so when people have that reaction to the confrontation, a lot of times what they inadvertently end up doing is present the image messages that the other side wants seen about them, because that's how they're responding to the confrontation. They're either fighting back or flight, retreating. And then in that, now we have this body language that gets interpreted. Okay. So, and what I've learned is that it's people don't understand that. They think, well, if I fight back, then I'm just showing everybody that I'm justified and that they're wrong. No, you're not showing them that. You're showing them that you're being the bully that they're accusing you of, that that you're not answering a question directly and they're accusing you in the case of not paying attention. And now you're not paying attention to the question. Those analogies are made in the context of the testimony to the story of the case. And so when the witness has that understanding, a lot of anxiety can be relieved just by kind of having that, starting to get a deeper understanding of what it is that they're supposed to be doing. Also, the limitations of their messages. Sometimes witnesses feel like the entire case is on their shoulders. It's not. It is the rare situation where one witness carries an entire case. And so when they understand their piece of the puzzle, when they understand the support that they're going to get from the other pieces of the puzzle, it can help them a lot. But the important thing is that you're identifying how this person responds to stress and helping them manage through that. So, when you prep a witness, there's the core of who a human being is. That's their personality. And odds are that is not going to be changeable. And if you're in a situation where you feel like, when I get the call, like, all right, Melissa, I need you to come and fix this witness, and I just need you to do a complete personality overhaul. I'll tell you right now, that is not going to work. What works is understanding the gap between the core of their personality, who they are when they're comfortable, and their reaction to anxiety and what's happening with their communication during that time of anxiety. The preparation, a change can happen in between those two spots. And so it's understanding that. Part of that is not just understanding, here's the evidence, witness, that I want you to give because it's good for my case, but it's understanding, who is this human being? And are they capable not only of saying that, but of being that from an image message? And sometimes what I have found is that my job becomes not just working with the witness, but working with the attorney on what are the messages we're really trying to get this witness to say, and where do we need to change to account for the human being who's saying. Again, it's that importance of image. It's, how do we need this person perceived? We're presenting a doctor. How does a person present themselves as a doctor? If we're presenting an injured person, how does that person present themselves to be credible and sympathetic? Those kinds of things, in addition to the actual words. And the last piece I want to make sure that we address is what I call is the look inward. It's understanding where our own psychology comes in. And this is the piece that I find is most ignored by litigators, because we're trying to tell our story to someone else, and we're trying to get a witness's behavior to change. But here's the thing, all of those things about stress, all that behavior, all that like feeling sick in your stomach before you eat, all of that happens to you too. And so it's having that ability to be introspective and understanding, how do I respond to anxiety? How do I respond? Am I the kind of person that I try to outsmart everyone? And I see this all the time. Super duper smart lawyers, just smarter, some of the smartest people in the world who don't understand that not everybody's as smart as they are. Not everybody's as clever as they are. And so you have these brilliant brains telling stories that no one else understands. So, how does your behavior, how does your psychology, how does your knowledge, we call, there's something, and this is true for you and for witnesses, there's something that we call the curse of knowledge. And it's basically the difficulty that we have understanding what other people don't understand. And it's something that's been studied as early as preschoolers in this thing called the theory of mind, where you have this little story and you have two people, and it's like Jane and Tom. And Jane has a piece of chocolate and puts it on the table and walks out of the room. And then Tom takes the chocolate and puts it in a drawer on the other side of the room. Now, when Jane comes back, where does Jane look for the chocolate? Well, children, once they develop theory of mind, will say, well, Jane will look for it on the table because that's where she left it. Children, before they develop theory of mind, say, she'll look for it in the drawer because they don't understand that they now have information that Jane doesn't have. Now, you would think that, in that simple example, when you think it through, we must get better at theory of mind as we get older. Actually, when it's not that concrete, we're worse at it when we get older. Because we have ingrained that the information, our beliefs, confirmation bias. Remember, it all comes back to those biases. They calcify in our minds, and it is hard for us to see another way. So when I first talked about confirmation bias, when I first talked about availability bias, I was talking about jurors. But guess what? You have those same biases within you too. The important thing is to be able to recognize them and to understand where are they affecting your decisions, where are they affecting your perceptions, and how you're telling the story. And are you telling the story based on you, or are you telling the story based on other people who are actually going to be making the decision? Another thing, we talked about COVID. I don't know if some of you may or may not have heard of a little book called Who Moved My Cheese? It is it's actually a great, a book of an analogy about how people respond to change. And it's about 4 critters in a mouse maze who day after day would go through the maze and they would find the cheese in the same place. And one day they went there and the cheese wasn't there. And so it went through each of the different characters and how they responded and the fact that cheese wasn't where they had found. And the ones who adapted, who went and took another round and said, well, okay, it's not here anymore. I got to find my cheese somewhere else, versus the ones that kept going back to the same place over and over again, hoping to find the cheese that had been moved. Okay. So it's adapting to that change. And so what I say is the COVID moved our cheese. The COVID moved all of our cheese, right? So how are we adapting to that? And so, as I work with attorneys and we're heading back to jury trial, they're going back to what they knew in 2019. I showed all those changes that have been happening. We go back to, we're going to try the cases the way we did in 2015, 2016, because that's just the way that I'm used to it. It's so important to be open and to be flexible in yourself, in understanding that the world changes and that what we know today may be different tomorrow. And so it's keeping that mental vigilance, not letting yourself get into that routine. So part of being a trial lawyer is being able to be introspective and to reflect on your own thoughts, reflect on what is it that's causing you to make those decisions that you make. Because those image messages apply to you as well. You are a reflection of your client. And the way that people perceive you is going to impact the way that they perceive things. So, one of the last things I want to talk about is the danger with all of those things that I'm talking about. It's sort of the information we want to take in and be constantly questioning, constantly challenging ourselves. The danger of assumptions. Now, this is a lesson of assumptions from Afghanistan. This is before the current Afghanistan crisis, but it's still a good story. So this was back maybe 10, 15 years ago in Afghanistan, when the US troops were in Afghanistan and trying to control certain attacks by the Taliban. And so they were eliciting the help of community members, and they had a hotline and said, well, if you see any Taliban activity, you call us and we're going to come in and we'll deal with it for you. So all we need you to do is tell us what's going on. Handed out pamphlets, they put up the billboards, spent all this money communicating. No phone calls. Taliban activity here, Taliban activity here, no phone calls. All right, well, I guess the message didn't get through. We need to push even harder on communicating. More billboards, more pamphlets. Let's get building the advertisement. Here's the number. Maybe they don't know the number. Let's put the number out there more. And here's what they didn't do. They didn't go out there and talk to people about why they weren't home. And someone had the bright idea when they still were getting their phone calls. Maybe we should talk to the people about why they're not calling so we can better understand what their resistance is. And so when they actually went and spoke to the people of the community, the people said, well, yeah, we saw the advertisements, and yeah, we knew what the number was, and yeah, I would have been happy to call. But what would happen is that when the Taliban came into town, the first thing that they did was shut down the cell phone towers so we couldn't call you. So they didn't need more information. They didn't need more motivation. They needed stronger cell phone towers. And that's what happened. And this was after several $1 million of spending to communicate something that they already knew. And it was targeting the wrong issue. So assumptions can be so dangerous. It can be so dangerous in the way we tell our cases. All of these things that I'm saying are ideas, observations about the world. We can't assume how that's going to affect every case until we look at each case specifically, it's how we do. It's part of it. It's our job as lawyers. It's our job as people who want to tell these stories. And so it's really about not just sending that message, knowing what message we want to send, but are we sending it in a way for it to be received in the way we want it to be received? And it has to do with all of us as litigators, as witnesses, as jurors. So that is the end of my presentation. If anybody has any questions, I am more than happy to answer them.
I'll try to see if I see any hands go up. I know that sometimes it's hard to see those. Let's see. Any questions for Dr. Gomez?
I answered them all.
I mean, that means you must have really, talked to them.
I covered the bases.
Absolutely. So thank you so much. We're going to give you a Zoom round of applause here. So thank you so much. And again, I do have a raffle of her book, Outside In. So I'm going to try to see if I can, if you can maybe stop screen sharing really quick, Dr. Gomez. I'm going to try to screen share. Let's see if I can do it here. Screen share a photo of your the cover of it. Hopefully folks can see this. Let me know if you can't see it for some reason. So this is going to be the book we're raffling off, and we'll make sure that if you are selected as the raffle recipient, that we'll private message you to get your best mailing address. So Chloe, if you're there, if you can rattle off, let's see, we have about 40 folks in the room. So if you can rattle off, a number between 1 and 35, so I know it's me, you, and the speaker here, then I'll just count down my attendance list and see who that ends up being.
17.
Okay, give me one moment here. Let me start at the top. Okay, Michael Funk. I have Michael Funk as our recipient of Dr. Gomez's book here that she wrote. And so what we'll do is, Michael, if you can just private message me your best mailing address, that would be great. And we'll get that over to you. Again, thank you, Dr. Gomez. It's been great. There's a lot of things that you talked about that, resonated with me because I was a DA for 6 years. And during those jury trials, I would think about those kind of things, which is, what kind of molds how jurors perceive not only us, but just being in trial in general. So thank you so much for your time. And then folks, if you have any other questions, let us know. And we'll get the questions over to Dr. Gomez for you and get those back. So thank you again. Thank you for being here at our seminar series. And those of you who need MCLE, again, make sure to email baxterfellow@ggu.edu to get your MCLE. Thanks so much.
Thanks everyone. And congratulations, Michael Funk.
We'll see you next time.